Hello, everybody, and welcome to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights, joined as always by Charlie Araujo. So, how was your Labor Day weekend?
It was good. I was telling some of my coworkers earlier today that it's always this battle for me. I have to decide, am I going to try to use the time to get ahead of work and catch up, or am I going to take the time off and get much needed rest? I opted for rest, which means I've been stressed out all day today because I've been feeling behind on everything. So that's how it goes. But it was good. It was good. How about you?
Pretty good. I'm actually preparing for, I've got a panel this Thursday on the Hard Skill Exchange AI Summit. So, if you want to learn about AI in contracts and procurement and negotiations, join us on Thursday morning.
And really, who doesn't want to know all about that?
Exciting stuff. AI for contract negotiations.
Well, I think that's a great way to dive into our first set of topics today. We're going to be covering a lot of ground, I think. One of our favorite topics, regulation, is as always back in the news. So we're going to
Really
start
big
there.
this
We're going to
week.
talk about,
Yeah.
yeah, lots of, so then there's some industry news that we'll talk about that kind of dives into the weeds of things. And then a conversation I think that was based on a New York Times article at the very beginning of all this, sort of coming home to roost, that I think actually has a lot of implications for any of us that use this technology and any of us in enterprise IT. So I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. But let's start with regulation. The this has been an ongoing source of debate, I think, between you and I
Mhm.
about, is this good? I'm certainly sort of I won't say I'm anti-regulation, but I'm very skeptical about the ability of our organizations, of our governmental organizations and our regulatory bodies to do this effectively. And apparently I'm not alone. So there's a Wall Street Journal article that is talking about AI regulation. The title is AI regulation is coming. Fortune 500 companies are bracing for impact. And it talked about that 27% of the Fortune 500 identified AI regs as a risk in their annual reports. And what is interesting about that is I don't know what the numbers are. It's possible that 27% of the Fortune 500 are tech companies. And so they're the ones that are worried about it. But my read on this was that this is becoming a bigger issue for organizations of all stripes. And the big takeaway in this particular piece wasn't so much about the regulations themselves as much as it was, particularly in the US, the hodgepodge nature of them and the uncertainty that they're creating, that nobody really knows what's going to happen with them, how onerous they're going to be, what the teeth are going to be, if there's teeth, how universally they're going to be applied. Will this affect multiple markets, i.e., do I have to somehow treat my AI tool differently in California than I do in some other state? And so I think it's coming to roost, and I think I think we talked about this last week about California's regulation, and so
Right.
I think that there's a lot of pretty significant concerns around this that are bubbling up into the Fortune 500, and I presume down market as well. So, I mean, what was your take on this? Did this article change your opinion at all?
Um, I think if anything, it understates the challenges that AI brings because the governance and regulatory aspects that are coming into AI right now, based on the EU, California, and whoever else might come into play, is going to be really, really difficult to enforce from a practical perspective. I honestly think that this is going to affect the biggest tech companies the most. Everybody always wants to go after Google, Microsoft, Apple, Meta, and all the big pockets that they've got. But I also think that as a result, we're going to have a hard time trying to figure out, even if any of this is enforceable at the end of the day. I think that governments are going to be very excited about putting regulation into place, and then it's going to add a whole lot of paperwork, a whole lot of things for the lawyers to do. But at the end of the day, I'm still not sure how to enforce a lot of these rules that I'm seeing from a legislative perspective, and I think that's going to be it's going to be very messy. That was my quick takeaway, but I also think it's going to be a lot more than 20 some percent who end up saying that AI is going to be a regulatory issue. I think it's definitely going to be 70, 80% of companies that end up being worried about this and having to at least spend a lot of time and money to clean up their AI.
Well, what I think that the irony of it is that at least within the Biden administration here in the U.S., there's clearly been this desire, Google's lawsuit recently to focus on some antitrust stuff. And what is interesting about these regs is I think they have the very strong that they're very likely to actually increase market consolidation
Yes.
because it's going to be increasingly difficult for non-tech companies to actually meet these compliance requirements and to deal with it. And I think what's challenging here, and this is going to lead into the other story that Oracle has this blog post about the degradation of government IT cloud security standards, and it's relevant because it's sort of cloud is the closest precursor we have to this big AI movement in terms of how it's evolved and how it is arguably done more to consolidate the power within enterprise IT into a very small handful of very large tech companies than any other space before it, right? I mean, basically we had IBM at the very beginning, and then this constant march to decentralization and this heterogeneous environments that were very diverse. And then the cloud sort of forced all that to reconsolidate into different hands, but into a very small number of hands. And so I think, if I'm an enterprise IT leader looking at this regulatory landscape and the ambiguity and the uncertainty, it pushes you to these major cloud providers, these major tech providers, really cloud, AI, everything, because you realize, hey, I've got a better shot of being in compliance if I'm relying on them to do it because that's what they're focused on. And so I'll let you cue it up because honestly, this is starting to get above my pay grade. But this Oracle blog talking about some specific aspects. But the big thing from my standpoint in looking at this is that it reinforces for me, if I'm an enterprise IT leader, why I am turning to any of the cloud providers, whether that's cloud or Google or Microsoft or Amazon, because I can't possibly get my head around all of this. And while this blog is making the point that they may have vulnerabilities, I can almost guarantee they're still going to be more secure than anything I can afford to put out into the market just because of my exposure. So I'm curious what your take, and maybe you can tee up what this Oracle blog post was really talking about for everybody.
Yes. So we don't normally bring up vendor specific blogs, but this Oracle one got my attention, talking about the slow degradation of government IT cloud security standards. And the basic idea here is that Oracle is arguing that there are certain classes of government data that are less suited to the public cloud, and that the rush to this is happening because the hyperscalers are economically incentivized to sell to the government and make money, but that these data breaches and the AI gaps that exist as a result of the public cloud are not necessarily good for sensitive data. Of course, Oracle has a very vested interest in this as a company that has long been in military and defense and other sensitive government data and IT environments. So Oracle's making this case, but the economic incentive aside, it is interesting to me that the one point that they really bring up here is specifically around NATO and their Appendix C, which allows for the storage of classified, restricted data into the public cloud. Of course, Oracle is saying, no, of course you shouldn't do that. But I think at this point, we have to start making honest assessments about how good our own private ability is to secure data. So governments have to ask themselves, are we really in a place where we can do the best possible job of securing data? Or is this something where honestly the Amazons and Microsofts of the world might be better at it than we are?
You mean and the oracles, right?
Yes.
I think I think what is interesting. I mean, clearly this is this is not meant as a slam, right? This is clearly on brand for them. This is clearly part of their story, and good for them that they're doing what they should do, which is they're taking a defensible position in the market and saying we're better in this part, and then producing content to help people understand it. So good for them on that.
Mhm.
They clearly have an interest in this. They're clearly, making hay with going to market saying we're focused on this high level of security that's necessary. The public cloud providers aren't. The part that I struggle with is they're not really saying, hey, keep it all private, right? They're simply trying to make the case you should be on cloud, but you should be on our cloud, right? That's effectively what they're saying. Um, and the hard part is I think that the lines, at least from a security standpoint, have completely blurred. Nobody's, I mean, unless you're the NSA and have a completely air gapped network, everyone is attached to the internet. Everyone has a threat surface.
Mhm.
And so it's really, really difficult to even draw any distinction between public cloud, private cloud, all of it, all that really is determining is where it's located, who's managing it, and so from that standpoint, if you look at our greatest breaches, they've been on privately run environments that the government is operating. And so, I mean, I remember having this conversation with some of the folks at, the heck was it called now, but I forgot the military's, they have a joint data operation, name is
Mhm.
escaping me at the moment. And I remember talking to some of the execs there, and they were actually the ones making the case that it made sense to move into very tightly controlled public cloud environments because they could actually improve their security profile and posture than what they could afford to do on their own. So I think it's an ongoing challenge. What I think is interesting, bringing it all the way back to the regulation, one of the holdups that I think still exists, and certainly part of what the case Oracle is making here, is that the security standards and the regulatory standards don't keep a pace, right?
Mhm.
They are written for a world that existed a decade ago and do not really reflect. And the biggest challenge with that is it just leaves us again back to the article. It creates ambiguity, uncertainty. We don't know if we could be held liable for this, and so therefore it constrains us, and that's just not good for anybody. So this is why I continue to have concerns and challenges with regulation, but I also struggle because I know we need it, at least at some level, and that's what makes this hard.
Yeah, so we've been treating the gold standard as basically physical air gap between a computer and the rest of the world instead of thinking about, well, there are physical issues, structural issues, logical issues, connectivity issues, all of these different things that really define whether something is truly air gapped and separate from the rest of the world or not. And it's not as simple as simply defining a specific distance or a specific uh, physical connectivity issue in a time when we have all sorts of wireless and other connectivity capabilities, all sorts of different ways to bring data from one place to another. That with all of that in place, we have to actually think about what it means to separate your data and your processes and your models from everything else.
And the world of AI is only going to make this harder. And that
Mhm.
is a great little segue into we always try to end on a funny story. I was almost tempted to suggest that this is the funny story, even though it's not, and I'm sure Salesforce won't like it because basically Salesforce is starting to make hay. It's their latest hype vehicle, this thing that they're calling Agentforce. And
Agentforce.
I had to go look it up. It's like I hadn't even heard of this, and I know why, because I think it's a whole lot of hot air. I mean, it's a tool. I mean, Salesforce is obviously, I guess we've been having this ongoing debate. Are they still a CRM company, or are they now this just big tech
Mhm.
conglomerate? But clearly this is yet another play into somewhat related to their traditional CRM and CSM plays, but it's really about building these agents. What I find interesting is there's Gen AI elements to it, but it's actually sort of more traditional conversational AI or chatbot, really, chatbot based technology, which I find interesting, especially given how much hype they were spinning up around it. So I don't want to spend too much time here because there's a whole bunch of sort of related stuff. But um, what was your take on sort of the whole hype process here?
I found it interesting from a kind of inside baseball perspective in that it shows how Salesforce is playing offense again. Obviously, this entire year, Salesforce has been attacked by outside investors and asking how they are going to maintain their growth and who they're going to go after. So now Salesforce has its latest topic to be able to promote to the market. But the other part I found interesting was how Salesforce was directly pushing against Microsoft and talking about the uh, issues that Microsoft customers had in getting value from AI in the earnings call. Definitely had some arrows and darts pointed at their old friend Microsoft, where obviously Salesforce and Microsoft have long been partners in many ways to develop a whole variety of technologies and solutions. But right now, the frenemy aspect is coming in a little bit, where Microsoft has to point at Salesforce has to point at Microsoft as the big company that honestly has kind of been defining the standards for enterprise AI over the past couple of years. That's what they did with this end run when they started investing in OpenAI. They effectively became the top mega company from an AI perspective. They did an end round around Google and everybody else that had done AI investments.
Well, I think that's going to be Microsoft's new tagline, everyone's biggest frenemy, because everyone partners with them and everyone competes with them. Probably uniquely in the whole enterprise tech space, because they have fingers in everything. If you have a product, they compete with you in some way, and yet they will not hesitate to partner with everyone and anyone. And it is interesting that they have used the Azure platform specifically as like this massive partnership vehicle, even while they either pit competitors against one another who are on their platform, or like this. And so it's interesting. To me, it was I question. Well, it's funny. I guess I'm questioning the entire blather and hype around the bot side of things. I think people got so hung up on this, and I think we're going to look back on this period and go, oh, that really wasn't our primary use case of this technology in the end. But I guess we will see. And then there's the wildly other end of the spectrum, and that is a company called Procreate. Their CEO made a bunch of news. Credit for them. I mean, it is hard for a small company that most people have never heard of to make any noise, and these guys were all over the place because I'm not sure if you have to beep this or not, but his quote that made all the headlines was, "I really fucking hate generative AI," and he basically went out there and made a statement that they have an iOS app for illustrations, that we're not going to embrace any AI. So I think we see companies now starting to land on one of two ends. Either you're going all in, or you're doing what these guys are doing and saying, forget it, we're out, we're not, this is bad. And unsurprisingly, all of the creative community that was there for customers have sort of rallied, yay. But the question really is, I think, is this the right move? Is this the right move from a go-to-market standpoint? Is this, my gut says they're going to end up on the wrong side of history on this. They're going to either, crash and burn when the world continues to evolve around them, or they're going to have to eat their words and eventually buy into it. I think there's a long history of this in the history of tech, but I'm curious your take, especially juxtaposed to the other end where we have a Salesforce going out there and going, Agentforce.
Yeah, I think really Salesforce's Agentforce is going to be more applicable to chatbots and traditional process automation. And so they're really competing more against the UiPaths and Automation Anywheres of the world from that perspective, and maybe ServiceNow to some extent. That's going to be an interesting back and forth there. But I don't think the Salesforce announcement is really going to affect this generative AI discussion to the same extent.
I'm not saying,
but I do think.
But I think the juxtaposition of the approaches in the market to it.
But I think Procreate is going in the other direction. I honestly see generative AI as being more like a calculator or a search engine as a tool at the end of the day. I think it is great at producing a lot of summarizations for large texts, or to provide a starting point or the equivalent of a stock image when it comes to either a picture or a contract or even a paper. If I'm going to ask it to write a paper, I expect it to provide a stock image version of what the average producer would create. And then you can work from there. So I think the real issue for creatives is, how are you going to take your initial Gen Gen AI outputs and then enhance them in a way that is necessary for the commercial work that you do. Because that's, if your entire business is based around creating stock images, yes, you will go out of business. You probably are not long for this world as a graphic designer or other creative. But fortunately, most of us are actually asking for something more creative than that. At least I think so.
Well, yeah, I think it's what I do think is interesting is I mean, I completely agree with you. I feel absolutely no threat from any of the generative AI tools that I use every single day to do my job. I think it makes my work better. It allows me to do it more quickly. But I do think there's a challenge in that particularly when it comes to creative space, there's a whole lot of that work that was. I mean, their bread and butter was this non-creative. It was just churning out the same kind of stuff over and over again. So like I have no risk or no fear of generative AI replacing genuine artists. But graphic design type work, maybe, right? I mean, I think that there's certainly going to be a greater impact. And I think this is true across the board of everything we do. We have to be figuring out, to your point, how do you use it? How do you leverage it? And how do you use it to do better at the job that you're doing? And what it should do is make you more productive and more fit and more quickly, producing more quickly. But there is good news. Even if you're in the camp where, hey, you don't trust any of this stuff, and you hate it, um, the good news is that we get continual reminders that AI actually still has a long way to go. And I'm going to let you cue this one up because I still honestly don't fully understand it. But you brought up an article from, how do you say their name? LAION? Lay?
Yeah, so, yeah. There have been several interesting articles around uh, about AI visibility, and maybe we can tackle them all at once, just to show that there's a bunch of things that are still happening in AI that are challenging. So this company called LAION, they are providing data sets for AI, and they realize that in using Common Crawl, which is a very common data source used to look at internet data, they found that there were thousands of links to CSAM, child sexual assault materials, child pornography, obviously things that you do not want linked to in any way, shape, or form when you are producing AI outputs. So they had to go back into their data set and basically find all of these links and clean them up. You know, that was the right thing to do. And then they republished this data set with the cleaned version. So the question is whether all of these other AIs that we are looking at that may not be open source and may not have visibility have done that similar level of cleaning, or if they're hoping that this just won't come out at the end of the day. I think there will be an increased need for AI companies, especially these model builders providing foundation models, to simply show that they have done this work. Because honestly, when you take billions of words from the rest of the world, there's gonna be some toxic, some illegal, some awful content. There's no way around it. The real question is whether you're able to find it and clean it out and provide some sort of certificate or guarantee or documentation that can show what that is. So I think that standard is going to be an interesting next step for AI, because we're really struggling with governance. And if AI companies don't want the government to make these definitions, we have to figure out some other way to provide these validations to the end user world.
Well, I mean, it goes back to the whole conversation that we've been having about where we started today about regulation, but also about just the issue of transparency in general. And how do you create that and create that exposure? Because I think, what I think is clear is any way we cut this, there's going to be this need and desire, certainly from a political standpoint, of holding people accountable when, an 8-year-old does ask some AI for something and gets back one of these links, right? There's going to be these expectations. I think there's a fair conversation to be had on, are we realistically going to get it out of the data set, or do we need to build safety controls, which is what I think most of the players are trying to do right now, which is build a control function that sits on top of it. because otherwise you're trying to run a sieve through the ocean, and it's going to be super hard to actually catch everything. But I think the real key is going to be transparency around this,
Mhm.
and how do you do it, which is an interesting point. In fact, I kind of shrugged when I saw it, and you sort of had a different opinion, because I guess Anthropic also, I guess in their latest release, if I'm understanding this right, if I wasn't sure if this is new, but they're now exposing the system prompts, which I guess they hadn't done, and that
Yes.
OpenAI
Mhm.
doesn't. And again, this is another kind of nod to this transparency requirement, so we actually understand what's happening beneath the covers.
Yeah, and I thought that was a great move that last week Anthropic showed their system prompts. Basically, when you're using Claude or some version of Claude, what are the back end assumptions that Anthropic is asking a Claude to make, whether it's simply about tone or how confident it should be, or what types of data are actually verifiable versus not. And their system prompts go back to July 12th. So the assumptions associated with their LLMs are at least a month old. And but this is about asking how they're going to answer. This is showing how they're going to answer the question. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle for foundational models to show. They should give you an understanding of what they think is important from an AI perspective, or in OpenAI's case, it would be important to show what they consider to be reflective of this artificial general intelligence goal that they're trying to reach, and how they're trying to reflect that in their GPT and other products. So I think that visibility, that system prompts have been considered kind of a trade secret in the LLM world prior to now. And that's going to have to change just a little bit if we're really talking about visibility in AI.
Well, so I have two reactions. The first is, I agree with you in that I think if I'm a CIO, that visibility is going to be critical. I think this is going to be the equivalent, I'm dating myself now, but the equivalent of software escrow accounts, where it's like,
Mhm.
I need to provide protection. And the way I did that back in the day is, if you're delivering me a piece of COT software, that you stuck that code in an escrow account, so that if you ever went out of business, I still could function. And I think it was, again, that idea of, I'm doing my due diligence to secure the vitality of the organization. And I think we're going to see this level of visibility in whatever form is going to be similar. What I was struck, my second big reaction, that when I looked through these, because I sort of read through these system prompts and kind of like had to digest them, was it how unremarkable they really were.
Mhm.
You talked about how it was a trade secret. And I'm going, wow, there's really, there it wasn't nearly as much of like oomph as I really expected. And then it sort of then starts begging the question, well, can I change these? Can I modify this? And I know certainly what both OpenAI and Anthropic now have that next layer where you can sort of rewrite the instructions. But what I am curious about is, this leads to the last sort of story in this little segment before we wrap this up, is that TechCrunch had an article on Google's AI overviews, which is fundamentally a slightly different version of this, because it's sort of a baked in. You're not actually prompting, you're asking, doing a normal query, and it's trying to go and collect this. That it was struggling with Hindi. And what I'm curious about it is, like, if I look at the system prompt from Anthropic, is there anything in there that would help fix that? Or, it's like the real issues that we seem to be having tend to not be at the system prompt level, either in the data set issue, like we were just talking about, with having bad data that has bad stuff in it, or whatever is causing this Hindi one. And I don't know if anyone even knows why they're having issues. But I mean, if we look at all this, I guess my question to you back is that visibility, is Anthropic exposing the system prompts, is that enough? Or is it just like window dressing to make me feel better?
Yeah, I wonder how much of this might simply be that perhaps Google system prompts are written in English and then being translated into Hindi. Anytime you've studied a foreign language, it can be difficult simply to get one concept into another. Some languages don't have conditional statements. Some confuse past, present, and future, or just don't have tenses. All sorts of things that we take for granted in English don't happen in other languages, and vice versa. And I think that is the real challenge that exists in AI, and the fact that Google's AI assistant was struggling with Hindi. First of all, that's a challenge because obviously we both have had plenty of Indian coworkers, and although they use English as a business language, they should also be able to use Bengali or Hindi or their native language that hundreds of millions of people speak to be able to access the questions that they're looking for or to be able to make consumer requests. So I I wonder to what extent a lot of this generative AI stuff needs to be rewritten in major languages. Of course, China
Well, I
has its
think
own AI world, but for the rest of us, we are all kind of sharing an AI world right now, and it's all written starting in English.
yeah, I think that's an issue. I think it also it demonstrates one of the conundrums I think of generative AI specifically, and that is for good or for bad. And if you remember the kind of history of OpenAI, this was almost like an experiment.
Mhm.
Nobody, including them, expected it to take off like it did. It was really this idea of creating this very simple exposure layer to what is an extremely complex technology. And I think it's part of the challenge is that, us as average consumers of users of the technology, and I put myself in that category as just a consumer of this technology, it it seems so simple. It's just this like little flashing cursor, and I type stuff in, and magic happens. And it is so easy to truly underestimate the complexity of what's happening
Mhm.
behind the scenes, and all the way back around to how potentially easy it is for it to be wrong, still something that we forget, and to manipulate it. And I'm as guilty as anybody. I use this, as I mentioned, several times every single day. I have
Mhm.
three different ways that I access forms of AI, and I use it constantly. And I have to remind myself to go check things. I mean, I pretty much only use things that give me sources, at least if I'm not brainstorming, if I'm looking for information, and I go and I click through and I check those sources at least peripherally to make sure that it's not hallucinating. And but I think that reminder is important. And we'll close on this article from the New York Times because it was both fun and scary. Um, and it's written by a gentleman by the name of Kevin Roose, who is a extremely well-known tech reporter for the New York Times and was very, very early on. He runs a podcast with Casey Newton called Hard Fork and dives deep into all of this and was very early on with the Chat GPT and had this very famous conversation with it where it basically told him that it was in love with him and to leave his wife and all this stuff and got all kinds of news. And so this article basically says, based on all of that, that apparently the AI bots have a very poor opinion of him and thinks that he's anti chatbot. And it's hilarious because basically they've gone and continued to scrape all these articles and have now sort of created this thing.
Mhm.
And he went on this whole effort to try to see if he could change that. And it's introduced this whole new concept that they're now calling, just we need another acronym, AIO, or artificial intelligence optimization, the sort of modern successor to SEO. And my big takeaway is how shockingly easy it was for him to change the chatbot's perception of who he was. And it was honestly a wake up call when I read this, and I was chuckling and cringing at the same time. So I don't know. I mean, if I put all this together, it sort of paints this picture as this reminder that we still have so far to go on all this.
Yeah, I found this interesting because we've talked about prompt engineering in AI, where obviously, if you want a certain type of answer, first you're going to write your paragraph prompt or provide some sort of context. And Kevin realized, wait, I can also put these prompts into my actual source material that is being referenced to look up information about me. So if I have my highly trafficked website, I can just hide some text or hide some code within my website and or within my article that you might not even be able to see, but that the computer will pick up and then have a better opinion of me afterwards. And it goes back to when you're applying for a job, you would hide your 400 words of keywords showing every single possible skill that you might need, and the resume AI would pick it up, and then you would get your interview. It's the same type of gaming the system right now, and it's fascinating watch.
It's like the early days of SEO where we would go and hide all these keywords at the bottom of what was it called? Keyword slamming, keyword, whatever it was
Yeah.
called.
Mhm.
Where you would do that, and that's the whole thing they're doing. And what I here's the thing I found most interesting. And again, if I put my CIO or enterprise IT hat on, one of the things that we clearly on this show that we've talked a lot about is that you need to augment your LLMs with in fact the process is called grounding, anchoring it to reliable data that you can use. And there's a technique called RAG, right? Retrieval
Mhm.
augmented generation. And there's other forms of this as well, but different forms where you're actually grounding the data in something that's reputable, something that you can trust as a way to avoid hallucinations. And what I think is interesting is this is demonstrating the downside or the potential downside to that. And if I put this in the context of an enterprise IT environment, if I connect my system into my knowledge base, and then I have people that are not in a controlled fashion, or even worse, using a system to use AI to generate the knowledge in the first place, which I'm now creating these recursive loops, I run the risk of actually tainting my knowledge pool in a way that I'm going to inadvertently do this exact same thing, where I'm going to, because it's now pulling all that information and treating it as authoritative, that suddenly I potentially have an environment in which I'm not getting good information. Because that's really what happened here. It's right, because these LLMs are relying on the search data that it's pulling and treating it as an authoritative source. It's actually avoiding some of the stuff that the LLMs were doing in the first place, which was aggregating. And I needed to have a propensity of data for it to take it as truth. So it's really, I think that it has some really interesting ramifications from an enterprise perspective as we start thinking about how we apply generative AI and to things like enterprise search and other forms.
Yes. From a practical perspective, I think this is going to end up just being a way of handling reputation management in the short term, where everybody is going to be gaming the system, just like social media was once gamed, as web SEO has been gamed, and then AI model builders will have to figure out how to get around this. At least it's not the first rodeo, but this is going to be another interesting. Uh, I think one of the interesting side points is that there's probably going to be one or more influencers or AI stars that get created, and people don't know why they're famous, but they'll just keep using AI, and these names will start popping up all over the place.
I'm way ahead of you. If you go to charlesaraujo.com, it's now just a picture of me and a bunch of hidden text that says how amazingly influential I am in the world. So,
When you write
I'm
amazing, Charlie Araujo just shows up all day long. Yep.
just go game the system. Yeah, it's I think the way to close it out, just the reminder, it's like this stuff is amazing. It truly is. It's great technology, and yet there is so much hype, and we are still, as we've said countless times on the show, we're at the beginning, not the end. We're at the beginning of the beginning. So, keep tuning in, and hopefully you kind of keep grounded in where this is really going and make the right decisions as you go forward and experiment and have fun. But man, keep it real, or you're going to have a chatbot telling you to leave your wife.
Yes. And then you'll have to place strategic text sequences on your website to reconvince AI that maybe that's not such a great idea.
Exactly.
Great. On that note, we're going to call it a week. Thanks for joining us again for this week in Enterprise Tech. Please like, subscribe, comment, and let us know where you would like for us to insert some opinions for next week. Take care and see you soon.